It's time to reprioritize your life. There's a massive industry that's built around this phrase. Thousands of podcasts are downloaded, thousands of books are sold on this premise of if you want the good life, if you want the happy life, it's time to reprioritize your life. You're in control of your diary. You're in control of who you open your front door to. You're in control of what you post on your social media. You are in control of what time of night you choose to read your work emails. It's time to reprioritize your life. But it's not a new thing. This is an ancient message that since the moment of the fall, God has been speaking to his people. It's time to reprioritize your life. What would it look like for you to really put God as number one in every aspect of your life? What would you have to reprioritize? What would you have to shift? What would you have to put down? What would have to be done differently in order for you to really put God as number one in everything in your life? And really, this is the crux of the message of Haggai that we come to look at this morning. It's time to get your priorities right. Through this series, we've followed God's people, Judah, into exile. Through the prophet Jeremiah, God and others before him, God had spoken to the people of Judah whose hearts had gone far away from God. And God spoke to them, and many times he said, "Come back to me, start living for me once again." But the people kept living away from God, not for God. And so through Jeremiah and others beforehand, God prophesied, he spoke to his people, and he said to them, you're going to go into exile. Another nation is going to come, and they're going to take you out of the very promised land that I said was yours. But you're going to be there for a while. And through Jeremiah, God said to the people, I have got plans for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. But by the way, it's going to take 70 years of you being out of the promised land, 70 years in exile before that happens. So dig deep roots here. Be fruitful, because I'm going to bless you in the exile land. And by the way, I'm going to bless the peoples around you as well, so pray for them. And then God began to raise up certain people in exile to bring about his ways and his purposes. People like Daniel, who lived wholeheartedly for God. Even when there were many other challenges and persuasions to live life differently, Daniel chose to live his life for God, because it really matters how we live our lives in exile. And then there were others that God raised up who knew that God had put them there for a particular time and purpose in life. People like Esther and Mordecai. But Babylon, who had taken over Judah, they'd got a little bit too big for their boots. They'd started to treat God's people too harshly. They'd started to treat God with contempt. And we see this prophesied in the middle of the book of Daniel. So God raised up another king. He raised up the Persians and the Medes, and they took over Babylon. So Cyrus becomes king, and he overthrows Babylon. And what Cyrus does is he says to all the exiles, all of God's people who've been taken into exile, he says, guys, you can go home. You can go back to your promised land. But what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to go back, and I'd like you to build a temple there, which, by the way, I'm going to finance for you. But what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to build that temple so that you would pray for me. So Zerubbabel and Joshua and Ezra go and they rebuild an altar to worship God. And then they start to rebuild the walls of the temple. But the thing was, not everybody went. Only about 50,000 of the Jews decided to go back from exile to the promised land to begin the rebuilding process. You see, some of them, they'd got comfortable in exile. They liked exile life. Their businesses were thriving. They were doing well. They were in a much better trading place than they had been in Jerusalem. And so they focused simply on what was in front of them now instead of what was ahead of them and what God had promised to them. They got comfortable, so they stayed in exile. I wonder if you're comfortable today. I wonder if you've got comfortable with keeping yourself to yourself. I wonder if you've got comfortable with the way life looks right now, when God may be calling you to look to what he has promised instead. Have you got comfortable in the exile land? I mean, the thing was, for those who were going back, it wasn't going to be an easy task. You know, they were returning to land that was uncultivated for 70 years. It's a nightmare cutting my back lawn when I've not mowed it for the whole winter, let alone 70 years. They were returning to uncultivated land. They were returning to a land that had been broken down and burnt down. They were returning to a land where there was no temple, no place of worship. They were having to start from scratch. It was not going to be an easy task. And along the way, there was plenty of opposition for them. But some of them went, and they started to rebuild the walls out of a heart for God, out of a love for God, out of knowing what the law of God had said. They went full of zeal and passion, and they began to rebuild. But then life got hard. They got disappointed. They got disillusioned. And one by one, they began to put down their tools. And instead of building the house of God, they started to build their own houses instead. And the message of God to the people who had returned through the book of Haggai, which is 3 prophecies, by the way, over just a short couple of months. There's a timeline in Haggai for us. God was saying this: it's time to get your priorities right. It's time to get your priorities right. If you've got your Bible with you, why don't you join me this morning in Haggai? I'm going to read the first part of Haggai chapter 1 for us this morning. I'm going to read from verse 2. This is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say, the time has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's house. Then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Is it a time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin? Now this is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. You have planted much, but harvested little. You eat, but never have enough. You drink, but never have your fill. You put on clothes, but are not warm. You earn wages only to put them in a purse with holes in it. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. Go up into the mountains and bring down timber and build my house, so that I may take pleasure in it and be honored, says the Lord. The people had started to build, but they got disappointed, disillusioned, distracted, and they put down tools and they started to build their own house rather than building the house of God. And God speaks to them and says, guys, it's time to get your priorities right. You started so well. You were the people who went. You were the people who left exile and you came back to rebuild. But look what you've done. Where is the fruit of your labor? A question for us this morning is this. What fruit do you see of God at work in your life? What fruit do you see in your life right now? If we struggle to think of what we see God doing in us or through us or around us, is it time to get our priorities aligned with God's once again? You see, the people who stayed in the land, they were comfortable. But now the people who've got back, they focused on their own comfort and their own preferences rather than on the house of God, on what God was doing. Now, the mistake that we make when we read Haggai is this. We think God is bothered about the building. God isn't bothered about the building of the walls. This is not a passage that is about the building of the walls. This is a passage about worship. This is a passage about worship. You see, the people were rebuilding because in the Old Testament, for God to dwell among his people, he had a temple, a place where his presence was. God wanted to dwell among his people. He wanted his people to be fruitful. They were the chosen nation, that God would bless all those around them. And so he wanted a place right in the midst of them for him to dwell. And their worship was their response. That as God has initiated through the law and other things, as God has promised us this land, our response is that we're going to build a temple for the presence of God to dwell. This is a passage about worship. You see, the problem is for too long we've defined worship as singing. Now, singing is part of our worship, but worship is not singing. And in the same way, we've defined worship as coming here on a Sunday morning. Attending a service is not worship, but it's part of our worship. You see, our worship is our whole life response to what God is doing and has done. And I want to ask you this morning, what are you building? Are you building a temple of worship to God in your own life? Or are you building and paneling somewhere of your own comfort? Richard Foster defines worship like this. Worship is the human response to divine initiative. Worship is human response to divine initiative. Worship is about how we live our lives in light of the fact that there is a God who is with us. Worship is about how we live our lives in view of the fact that God is not only with us, but he sent his only Son to show that he is with us. Worship is the response we have in our lives to God who loves us so much that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him will not die, but will have eternal life. Worship is our response to God. God was less bothered about the stonework that the people were building physically. He was more bothered about what they were building spiritually. Because the picture of what is happening was the people had built the foundations, they built the walls, and the walls were low, and then they had stopped. But actually it was a picture of what was happening in their own lives. They'd started so well, so full of passion for God. But then instead of building up the kingdom, instead what they focused on was building their own houses, focusing on their own comfort, focusing on their own priorities rather than on the house of God. How we live our lives in view of what God has done is incredibly important. We are the forerunners of the kingdom. We're like those who've gone back out of exile. We are the chosen people that God has his hand on as followers of Jesus to demonstrate to the rest of the world the new heaven and the new earth which is coming. We are the forerunners. We are the ones who are to capture God's heart for this world and to live it out among the world around us. What we do with our time, what we do with our money, what we do with the way that we live our lives, these things are noticed by the world around us, and we are called to capture God's heart and put those things first and foremost. Speaking to the people of Israel in the book of Amos, see, the people of Israel there, what they'd done is they'd focused on building their services, but they had missed what God's heart was for the world around them. And God's words were incredibly tough for us to hear to the people of Israel. In Amos chapter 5, God said this from verse 21, I hate. That's a tough word. I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps, but let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. The people had focused on getting their services right, but they had missed God's heart for the world around them. They'd missed God's heart for justice. They'd missed God's heart for the poor. They hadn't got their hearts aligned with God first and foremost. And I believe what God is calling us to as a people is this: to first and foremost be a people whose hearts are after him, and to reprioritize our lives, that we would have a heart of worship in everything that we do. Not building the comfort of our own lives, but playing our part in building in the kingdom. What God was saying to the Jews through Haggai was similar. From verse 9, you expected much. This is chapter 1 from verse 9. You expected much, but see, it turned out to be little. What you brought home I blew away. Why, declares the Lord Almighty? Because of my house which remains a ruin, while each of you is busy with your own house. Therefore, because of you, the heavens have withheld their dew, and the earth its crops. I called for a drought on the fields and the mountains, on the grain, the new wine, the olive oil, and everything else the ground produces, on people and livestock, and on all the labor of your hands. The people were lacking fruit in their lives because they hadn't prioritized the heart of worship. Because a heart of worship leads us to service. A heart of worship leads us to want to tell other people the good news of Jesus Christ, who died and rose again so that they can have eternity with God. The people had lacked fruit because they had focused on building in their own priorities rather than on the priorities of God's heart. I think God is saying to us right now, it's time to focus once again on him. To be drawn to that heart of worship that is a response to what God has done in and through our lives. But the people of Judah, as they returned, when they looked, they were disappointed. They were disappointed. They'd labored hard, but their fruit was little. Maybe you're here today and you're disappointed. Maybe you're disappointed at how the years looked. Maybe you're disappointed that we've got our masks on today. Maybe you're disappointed that we've not got the band at the moment. Maybe you're disappointed with how the restrictions have been this year. Maybe you feel disappointed. I want to say to you today, don't let your disappointment hinder what God wants to do in you and through you. For while we live with disappointment, we miss the heart of worship that trusts God in any and every situation. It's time for us again to ask God to give us a heart of worship. A heart of worship that is not about singing. A heart of worship that is not about the style we prefer. A heart of worship that is not about the preacher. A heart of worship that is not about personalities that will tell us what we want to hear. A heart of worship that is not about doctrine or about theology, but a heart of worship that is first and foremost on God who loves us, who has the best for us, who gave his Son for us and sent his Spirit to fill us, that he might change the world around us as the new heaven and the new earth come, because we are the forerunners of that new heaven and new earth. For too long have we lived in our panelled houses and neglected the house of God. It's time to ask God to give us once again a heart of worship. We live in a consumer culture right now. It's all about what we want. We can create what we want. We can get what we want. We can order what we want, and it turns up when we want it to. And we need to be so aware of this, because the danger is that it's slipped into the life of the church as well. Now more than ever, we need to be aware of consumer mentality when it comes to worship. It's all too easy for us to do right now. We can log on to the church that we find most attractive. We can tune into the worship bands that play the songs we like the best. We can find the worship songs that are in the key that we prefer, that are by the artists that we most like. We can listen to the preachers that fire us up the most. We can tune into the church that we think is the one that we would like to be part of, wherever it is in the world. But when was worship ever about what we want? Worship is our response to God's initiative in the world. And we are called to be building. But guess what? Jesus is building his church. So what is it that we're supposed to be building? The Bible tells us where to build one another up. Now is not the time to tune into a church in America or elsewhere in this country or wherever it may be, because the style of worship is more your preference. Yes, allow yourself to be encouraged by that. Yes, do that as part of your own discipleship. Yes, do those things as a way of building yourself up in your walk with Jesus Christ and being closer to him. But don't do it in the neglect of the church family that you are committed to, because the church is first and foremost a family where we are to build one another up and encourage one another, that God may build his church through us. Each of us has a part to play. Eugene Peterson writes this: too often we think of religion as a far-off, mysterious bureaucracy to which we apply for assistance when we feel the need. We go along to a local branch office and we direct the clerk, who we sometimes call a pastor, to fill out an order for God for us. Then we go home and we wait for God to be delivered according to the qualifications that we have set down. But that is not how it works. Jesus is building his church. And he's calling us to build one another up in these difficult days, in these tough days, that he might work in us and that he might work through us. Church is a family. What are we rebuilding right now? We're called to be, building one another up. We're returning from exile. It's time to reprioritize our lives and ask God once more to give us a heart of worship that is first and foremost about him, that our actions and our lifestyle that are built out of the initiative of what God has first and foremost done in our lives, and that our worship would be a response to that. And as we worship God by the lives that we lead, we would also be committed to his family and to building one another up, that we may go further together. Jesus says in John chapter 4, verse 23, "Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshippers the Father desires." It's time to be a people with a heart for God, who live lives of whole life worship for God, loving the Father who is with us every step of the way, to simply be close to him and be obedient to him. The people of God heard the message of God through Haggai, and in verse 12 of chapter 1 we read this. "Then Zerubbabel son of Shealtiel, Joshua son of Josedek, the high priest, and the whole remnant of the people obeyed the voice of the Lord their God and the message of the prophet Haggai, because the Lord their God had sent him, and the people feared the Lord. Then Haggai, the Lord's messenger, gave this message of the Lord to the people: 'I am with you, declares the Lord.'" You see, the building work started to happen because the people obeyed the Lord. What's God asking of you right now? As we've come out of this funny exile year and a half, what is God asking you? Does God want more of your heart in worship? Has God given you gifts that maybe you've laid down and forgotten about, and it's time to pick up the tools once again? Has God put certain people on your heart in order that he might work through you? Now is the time to be obedient to God, that the building may begin again. Many of you know that I'm useless at DIY, but every now and again I have a go. And sometimes when I have a go at DIY, if I get it right, I'm really proud of myself. You know, it's going to be one of those really difficult jobs, like putting a picture on the wall or something like that, or putting a curtain pole up. And I'll do the job and I'll be really proud of myself, and I'll go and get a cup of coffee, and I'll go back and I'll look at it later. And when I look at it, I'm like really disappointed because I noticed that one of the screws is half an inch out the wall because I've damaged the screw head on the end of it because I used the wrong size screwdriver. I'll notice that it's not straight in some way, or that I've made a mess of the plaster around it. And I look at it, and what I was so proud of, I suddenly realize I'm quite disappointed by my efforts. And I wonder if that's how God's people felt. In chapter 2, verses 3 to 4, we read this: "Ask them, who of you is left who saw this house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? Does it not seem to you like nothing?" The people have been building the walls, and they step back, and maybe they were proud of the work that they'd done. And from the comfort of their paneled houses, they look around, and they're disappointed. They went with the hopes that the temple would be like the stories they'd heard of when Solomon built the temple and it was laden with gold, and the presence of God filled it, and the priest couldn't minister because the presence of God was so thick there. And they look at the broken down walls around them, and they're disappointed. In the book of Ezra, we read how the people saw this. In Ezra chapter 3 from verse 12, we read, "Many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid, while many others shouted for joy. No one could distinguish the sound of the shouts of joy from the sound of weeping, because the people made so much noise, and the sound was heard far away." The people saw the temple that they were trying to rebuild. They were disappointed at the state of it. It wasn't like what it was beforehand. Those who'd seen it or the stories that they've heard of it, they were disappointed. And maybe today you feel disappointed. Maybe you look at church and the way we're doing things at the minute. We're kind of hymn sandwichy. We're using videos again at the minute. We're wearing our masks. Maybe you think of what we had and maybe today you're disappointed. Maybe you're disappointed at your own walk with God right now. Maybe you're disappointed because you're going through a tough time and it feels like God has abandoned you. He hasn't. He is with you. Maybe you feel disappointed right now when you look around. We'll probably experience what is written about in Ezra. Some of you will be rejoicing to be here today. Some of you will be a bit disappointed. If you're disappointed, I want to encourage you with this. That very temple that they wept over is the temple where Jesus was dedicated. That very temple that they wept over is the temple where Jesus sat as a young boy and listened to the teachers of the law while his parents had gone 3 days ahead of him. That very temple is the temple that Jesus walked in and turned the tables. That very temple that they wept over is the temple where the curtain torn in two and the presence of God went out into the world as Jesus hung on the cross at Calvary. Don't be disappointed by what you see right now, because God may well be doing something now that you may not even see in your lifetime that is for His glory. Don't be disappointed, but instead seek God with a heart of worship that says, God, I might not understand the circumstances right now, but I'm going to prioritize not the things that will make me comfortable, not the things that I want, but I'm going to prioritize you as first and foremost in my life, in a life of whole life worship. And I'm going to focus on serving and building up my sisters and brothers whom you've called me to be part of in this family that we call the church. Because God, I believe that you're building something now that I might not even see what you're going to do through it, but I believe, God, you're going to move in a great and powerful way. And God, I want to be part of it. That's what it means to live a life of whole life worship. Don't write off what God may be doing now because it isn't quite to what you prefer. Because God may be bringing something about that is more glorious than we may see or may know. It's time to be a people of whole life worship, to get our priorities right, to be a people of worship. Romans chapter 12 verse 1 says this: Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. See, worship is the divine initiative of God. It's in view of God's mercy that we offer everything of who we are to Him, even if we're disappointed, even if we're disillusioned, even if it's not what our preferences are right now, because we're trusting that God may be doing something that we don't yet see or know what He's going to do. It's time to reprioritize your life. What would it look like for you to really put God as number one in everything in your life? To live a life of whole life worship. To return to that heart of worship that isn't singing, that isn't style, that isn't preference, that isn't turning up in a particular building once a week, but is about loving God first and foremost. It's about loving our neighbor as ourselves, building one another up, and trusting that God is going to build something beautiful and glorious that we may not even see in our lifetime, but we may be the builders who are part of it now.